July. It's a month. Things happen during it. There's your video. Goodbye. I suppose I should say what I'm actually talking about. Hello, true crimerers. It's time for another TikTok compilation. I am a very cringy person. Yeah, it's time for their TikTok compilation. This is the series on my TikTok page called On This Day in True Crime History. I've already done April, May, and June compilations on here, so now it's time for July. If my math serves me correctly, and it never does. Yeah, you failed here again, bud. Only 13 videos. Nope, it's 12. For some reason, I didn't do many in July. Probably because I was on one of my many posting bans for typing the word sweet in the comments on TikTok. It's very frowned upon to do that. You're basically a terrorist when you just type the word sweet. Dear God, don't put a throw up emoji in the comments on TikTok, because I got I kid you not, I got a 3-day ban for a throw up emoji. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. Let's progress into the video, huh? So here you go. Here are 12 stories of things true crime-ish related that happened in the month of July. So please subscribe. I promise I'm not this weird usually. No, yeah, I am. But please subscribe, like the video, do all that stuff. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, I guess. All in the description below. Anyway, shut up, Mike. Jesus. Okay, here we go. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 1st. What happened on July 1st? Here at 8763 Wonderland Drive in Laurel Canyon, which is in Los Angeles, California, a quadruple homicide would take place. It would become known as the Wonderland Murders. Viewer discretion is advised. The house now is a split-level duplex, but back on July 1st, 1981, it was something, well, far more seedy. It was a drug house, and it was home to the Wonderland Gang. The gang was led by Ron Lanius. Ron, he had a history dating back to the Vietnam War when he was dishonorably discharged because he was smuggling cocaine in dead soldiers' bodies. And he was actually suspected of many murders, all gang-related. The Wonderland Gang had a arch nemesis, an opposition. Eddie Nash led his own drug-fueled gang. On June 29th, 1981, Ron Lanius and a couple other of the gang members would break into the home of Eddie Nash, disguised as police officers, where they would end up stealing over $1 million worth of drugs, cash, paraphernalia. And when it was all said and done, Eddie Nash was pretty confident that it was the Wonderland Gang who did this. At around 3 o'clock in the morning on July 1st, 1981, neighbors would later report that they heard the sounds of screaming coming from the Wonderland home. But none of them did anything. It wouldn't be until later that day at 4 p.m. when movers who were helping move a different house nearby heard the moans and screams coming from the Wonderland home. When police arrived, it was a bloodbath. They found 5 bodies inside the home, bludgeoned. The crime scene was just painted with blood. The faces of the victims were not even recognizable. The house appeared to be ransacked. Items were definitely stolen. 4 members of the Wonderland Gang were pronounced dead at the scene, including the leader, Ron Lanius, Billy Deverell. The moans and scream that people heard was from Susan Lanius, Ron's wife. Her skull had been caved in, but she was alive. She had been sitting there for 12 hours. She would end up surviving. Police would arrest cornstar John Holmes, a flip-flopper member of the gang, and Eddie Nash, and charge them both with murder. John Holmes was acquitted. There was no evidence against him. He bribed a jury member. He was acquitted. But years later, he said he did send members to go to the Wonderland home. Hello, true crimerers. It is now time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 2nd. What happened on July 2nd? Well, one of us has to change. This fella, with the biggest face of all time, it fits the whole phone, was Sebastian Alexander Shaw. There's his face. Hi. He was not a very good dude. I say was because he's dead now. Yeah. He was born in South Vietnam in 1967, but a few years after he was born, his family moved to Oregon, here in the United States. Throughout school, he had a couple of violent outbursts. He one time beat another student with a piece of wood. The student would end up being fine. But other than a couple of instances like that, there wasn't really a lot of red flags. On July 2nd, 1991, and unfortunately I do not have a confirmed photograph of the victim, but a 48-year-old man by the name of J. Rick Bale, he was found dead inside of his home. It appeared that he had been stabbed at least a couple of times in his throat. Now, how is Sebastian connected to Jay? He isn't. You see, Sebastian had been working at his job, but then he got fired. And apparently, he wanted to take his anger of being fired out on someone random. So he just so happened to be by the home of J. Rick Bale when he just broke in and he killed the man for literally no reason. Jay was laying in bed sleeping when he came in and stabbed him to death. So that happened on July 2nd, but let's tell the rest of this story. This was Donna Ferguson and Todd Rudiger. On July 20th, 1992, they were found brutally murdered inside their trailer home. This was also in Portland. Now, they were both tied up. Donna was sexually assaulted, and both of them were stabbed in the neck. The killer left behind their DNA. On May 27th, 1994, so a couple of years later, a woman by the name of Jenny Lynn was murdered inside of her home. I will tell her longer story in another video, but there was a point when Sebastian Shaw was suspected of her murder, but eventually he was ruled out. Oh, here we go again. On August 31st, 1994, Sebastian was arrested because he stole a car, and he was caught with that car. And inside the car, they found a murder kit. You know, gloves, a ski mask, duct tape. When he was arrested, his DNA was collected. The DNA matched the murder of Donna Ferguson and Todd Rudiger. And this would also link him to the murder of J. Rick Bale. He got 3 life sentences. He died in prison in 2021. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 3rd. What happened on July 3rd? This video is not going to have so much true crime, but it does have some disasters and a death, so it still fits. On July 3rd, 1970, a British Dan Air charter would crash into a mountainside near Barcelona, Spain. This was caused to a tragic mix-up at air traffic control. All 112 souls on board died. Next, on July 3rd, 1971, Jim Morrison, lead singer of The Doors, was found dead in a bathtub inside his apartment in Paris. His cause of death was ruled as heart failure, but some people feel there is a mystery behind his death. But no foul play was ever truly suspected. And finally, on July 3rd, 1988, a U.S. Navy cruiser shot down an Iranian passenger jet, mistaking it for an Iranian fighter aircraft. All 290 souls aboard Iran Air Flight 655 would die. The flight recorder, the black box, has never been recovered. And that is what happened on Today in True Crime History. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 4th. What happened on July 4th? Well, this was Benjamin Nathaniel Smith. And on July 4th, 1999, he would take his own life after committing a series of drive-by shootings. Benjamin grew up in Wilmette, Illinois, where he had on-again, off-again troubles with authorities. He would also become a follower of the creativity movement. The World Church of the Creator was definitely known as a hate group. They were a white supremacist religious group. They were homophobic. They wanted white separatism. They were anti-Semitic. The whole kit and caboodle. Now, Benjamin was considered a direct disciple of the group's leader, and when their leader, Matthew Hale, was denied the ability to practice law in Illinois, Benjamin decided he was going to take revenge. In the late evening hours of July 2nd, 1999, he would get inside his vehicle and he drove to the West Rogers Park in Chicago, Illinois, where he knew there would be a group of Orthodox Jews there. So he took out his gun and began to fire at them. He managed to hit 9 people, but none of those people died. Benjamin then drove to the Skokie, Illinois area, where he came across Northwestern University basketball coach Ricky Birdsong. He was outside jogging with his 2 children. It was just happenstance that he came across them. Benjamin took out his gun and fired from his vehicle, shooting him in the back, killing him in front of his 2 kids. July 3rd, he then drove to Decatur, Springfield, where he would just shoot at random people, and he did hit another person, an African-American minister in Decatur, Illinois. The minister would survive. On July 4th, 1999, he drove to Bloomington, Indiana, where he came across a 26-year-old Korean student by the name of Won Jun-yoon. He was on his way to his Methodist church. Benjamin took out his gun and fired from his car and shot him, and he would die. He fired at several more people and missed pretty much all of them. Police finally caught up with him on that July 4th, and there was a high-speed pursuit. When he just took out a gun when he was driving at high speed and put 2 bullets into his own head. He then crashed into a metal post, and he was still alive. So he put another bullet in his head, which then ended his life. And the creativity movement called him a martyr and a soldier in their movement. Hello, true crimeers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 7th. What happened on July 7th? Well, on July 7th, 1984, in Toledo, Ohio, the bodies of Virginia Temple and her daughter Rochelle were found inside their home. Virginia Temple had been strangled to death while her 9-year-old daughter was sexually assaulted and also strangled and then left inside of a crawl space. The other children who were inside the home who managed to survive said that it was 2 unknown black adults who came into their home and did this. Now, this was lining up with some events that were happening prior. On May 29th, 1984, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, a young girl by the name of Vernita Wheat was kidnapped. She was kidnapped shortly after her mother befriended 2 adults. Those adults were Alton Coleman and Debra Brown. On June 19th, 1984, the decomposing body of Vernita Wheat would be found in an alleyway. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. In early June 1984, in Gary, Indiana, 2 people fitting the description of Coleman and Brown were seen next to 2 young girls who would disappear. 9-year-old Annie Turks and 7-year-old Tamika Turks, they had both gone missing. Also on June 19th, 1984, the body of Tamika Turks would be found, and Annie was also there, but she was still alive. Both girls had been sexually assaulted, and they were both attempted to be strangled to death, but they failed on Annie. That same exact day, 25-year-old Donna Williams, she would vanish. Then on July 11th, 1984, her decomposed body would be found. She was found in Detroit, Michigan, sexually assaulted and strangled to death. And then it's believed that on July 5th, they managed to get themselves inside the house of Virginia Temple, and that is when they killed both of them. The couple is said to have convinced all of their victims in some way to come and let them in their home or meet them somewhere, and then the people they meet are either killed or they attempt to kill them. A manhunt would pursue to find this killer couple. They had at least 8 murder victims, and it spanned across 6 different states. They were finally captured on July 20th, 1984. It became kind of a hot mess in terms of how to prosecute these two people because of how many states were involved. At one point, Donna Brown tried to say that, oh, I was just a kidnap victim of him. But in actuality, she was very much involved in the kidnapping and the murder aspects. They prosecuted Alton Brown in Ohio first, where he was convicted and sentenced to death. And he was executed in 2002. Debra Brown was originally sentenced to death, but that was eventually overturned. She got life in prison. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 10th. What happened on July 10th? In the early morning hours of July 10th, 1996, down a country lane in Kent, England, the beaten bodies of one adult female and two children and a dog were found. The adult female and one of the young females and the dog were pronounced dead at the scene. The other young girl survived. Pictured here is the Russell family from England. The father, Sean Russell, the mother, Lynn Russell, and their two daughters, Megan and Josie. The day before, on July 9th, 1996, Lynn and the two girls were at a swimming function, and then they were going to walk home afterwards. But they never got home, and so Sean would report them missing later that evening. And then it wouldn't be until the following morning on July 10th when they discovered the bodies. It was Lynn and 6-year-old Megan who were pronounced dead at the scene. Josie would survive, but she had severe head trauma. She would eventually have to learn how to speak again, so she really couldn't even say who did this. Well, in July of 1997, after an episode of Crime Watch aired, people would call in with some tips. A psychiatrist would call and provide a tip that a patient by the name of Michael Stone was extremely suspicious. And then two co-workers of Michael Stone would also call to say that they were very suspicious of him. A few days before the murders, he was becoming extremely aggressive. He was lashing out in anger. He was threatening to kill people. The psychiatrist said he had threatened to kill someone with a hammer, and it was a hammer that was used to bash in the heads of the victims. Michael Stone had no alibi for the day in question. He would claim he had never even heard of the area where those girls were found. But then friends would testify that Michael was actually extremely familiar with that area. They said he knew it like the back of his hand. So why lie? Physical evidence, however, there was nothing that connected him to the murders. The murder weapon, the hammer, was found near the bodies, but nothing would directly tie to him. But he was arrested based on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. And in 1998, he was convicted of the murders. But then, because of some prosecutorial witness, the conviction was overturned, so he was retried in the early 2000s. He was then convicted again. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. In 2022, a man by the name of Levi Belfield would confess to the murders, but then he recanted. And that's kind of where we're left. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 11th. What happened on July 11th? Here at this house in San Bernardino, California, on the afternoon of July 11th, 2020, a man posing as a FedEx driver would knock on the door. When someone from the house opened the door, the delivery driver asked for Mr. Mark Angelucci. When Mark came to the door, the delivery driver pulled out a gun and shot him dead. He then got into his vehicle and sped away. Mark Angelucci was a very well-respected attorney in California. Despite his wealth, he was described as being a very humble person. He was described as just being a very sincere person and also a very fun person. He never married, he didn't have any children, but he absolutely loved being an attorney. It was his dream come true. He did, however, have a very controversial history of cases where he fought for gender discrimination against men. Police thought this could have something to do with why he was killed. You know, fighting for men's equal rights tends to get you a little... You get looked upon unfavorably, yeah. But police at the same time still didn't have any suspects or know who would have done this. 8 days later, they would pretty much find out. 8 days later, and across the entire country in New Jersey, a man dressed as a FedEx driver would approach this house. It was the home of a federal judge, Esther Salas, and also her husband, who was an attorney, Mark Andrel, and then their 20-year-old son, Daniel Andrel. He was their only son. When the FedEx driver knocked on the door, Daniel answered it, and Mark was right on his heels, just seeing who it was. The moment they opened the door, gunshots rang out. Mark was struck, Daniel was struck. Esther was actually down below in their basement doing some research, so she was unharmed. Daniel was pronounced dead at the scene, and Mark would end up surviving. Who would have done this? And why is it very similar to a case that happened all the way across the country in California? Well, that would be answered another 150 miles away near the Catskills in New York. Authorities would find a vehicle, and inside the vehicle was a man who was shot dead. His name was Roy Hollander, also an attorney, also a men's rights activist. In his vehicle, a FedEx package with Esther Salas' name, and also a document with the name Mark Angelucci on it. Boom. Connection. They would find CCTV footage of him and San Bernardino. He had a grudge against Mark and a grudge against Esther, so he killed them and then took the coward's way out. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 12th. What happened on July 12th? Well, I came into all this money and now I'm rich and famous, so peace out, losers. Hello! Just kidding, love you. This is only some of the recovered stolen goods from a bank heist. This was Valerio Vicci, and he had a lot of chest moss, apparently. He was from Italy originally, and he was, well, a bit of a bank robber of sorts. Well, not really of sorts. He was literally a bank robber. He robbed 50 banks in Italy, and he was a very wanted man. So in 1986, he would just run away from Italy and he would go to England. And he just got right back to it. He just started planning and doing bank robberies there. Some small ones here and there until the big one. On July 12th, 1987, Valerio, along with one little accomplice, they would enter the Knightsbridge Safe Deposit Box Center. They were able to secure the help of an inside man, one of the bank managers. They pretended like they wanted to go and rent a safe deposit box, so they wanted to see the inside first. Once inside, the two men pulled out their guns, and, well, they basically would force them to help open these boxes. A lot of them had to be broken open. In the end, they would end up taking off with 60 million British pounds, or in US currency, roughly $98 million at the time. This was in cash, in jewelry, and they just sort of quietly left, and the other people inside the building seemed to be none the wiser. But once the shift changed, they noticed and the police were called, and, well, yeah. This was one of the largest bank heists in the history of the world. While police investigated, they found a bloody fingerprint. That fingerprint would trace back to Valerio Vicci. So, a warrant was put out for his arrest as well as some known accomplices of his. By August 12, 1987, most of Valerio's team was arrested throughout a series of raids, but Valerio himself, he fled. He would return to England sometime later to, well, he wanted to pick up his car. A Ferrari Testarossa. Police were waiting for him, and then he was arrested. Valerio himself was sentenced to 22 years in prison. At some point, he was then transferred to an Italy prison to serve out the remainder of his sentence. He was released on April 19th, 2000, and he would be involved in some sort of shootout that day, and he was shot and killed. Yep, this almost was a story with no death involved, but huzzah! That was probably unwarranted. Okay, bye! Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 15th. What happened on July 15th? Well, it was an afternoon like every afternoon in Chowchilla, California. It was approximately 4 p.m. that day when bus driver Frank Edward Wroe was taking home about 26 students from a field trip. At some point during the drive, A white van was parked in the road, blocking Frank from moving forward. So he stopped the bus. 3 men came out of the van with guns, and they were wearing stockings over their face. One of the men took control of the bus and then drove it to a remote location, it appeared. They then forced everybody off the bus and then loaded them into a few more white vans. The kidnappers then drove the van around for approximately 10 hours before they finally stopped in Livermore, California. The kidnappers then forced everybody inside of this buried moving truck. Inside the truck were a whole bunch of mattresses and sheets. They also had a small amount of food and water. And then the kidnappers closed the doors and just left everyone in there alone. There was no guard inside the van. So, bus driver Frank Edward Ray and a couple of the kids stacked a bunch of mattresses on top to see if they could reach a small door that was on top of the truck. There was a circular lid that had been weighed down by some heavy objects. It took them some time, but they used like a wooden board to pry open the lid. It took some time, approximately 16 hours after they were loaded into the moving truck. The lid was fully opened and all of them were able to climb out. They then managed to get to a nearby guard shack where they were able to alert police. Now, it turns out the kidnappers had brought them to a quarry, and when police were finally involved in this, there was one suspect in mind. It was the quarry owner's son, Frederick Woods, and then 2 of his friends also became suspects. All of them had issues and troubles with the law in the past. Police were able to search the home where they lived, and they found a plethora of evidence. It took a few weeks, but all 3 men were eventually apprehended after they had fled the area. Their plan was to call in a ransom for roughly $5 million, but they couldn't because the news stations and phones were being flooded by the parents and families of the kids that day. And then they just fell asleep, which means the kids were able to escape. All 3 of them went to trial, and they were all convicted of kidnapping charges and others. And by March of 2022, all 3 have now been released on parole. Hello and good evening, true crimeers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 16th. What happened on July 16th? Well, none of these are really true crimes, but it fits the page. Well, on July 16th, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr., along with his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren, they were flying near the coast of Martha's Vineyard when the plane would crash into the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 3 passengers. The crash was believed to be because of spatial disorientation. Next, hardened criminal Martha Stewart was sentenced to 5 years in prison and 5 years house arrest on July 16, 2004. She had been found guilty of insider trading. Naughty, naughty, Martha. But can you make me some cupcakes, please? Thank you. And finally, also on July 16, 2004, in India, a school building would catch fire starting in the kitchen, which would then spread to the roof, and it would end up engulfing almost the entire building. The school at the time was extremely overcrowded, having far too many students inside because the school district, I guess, had lied about the student-to-teacher ratio. And because of this overcrowding, there would be children getting stuck in corridors, not getting through doors quick enough. The stairways, which were located next to the kitchen where the fire started, became engulfed in flames and smoke, so no one could get out that way. And in the end, 94 children would burn to death. And the school's founder, thankfully, was arrested and he was charged. He was sentenced to life in prison. And a couple other school staff were also charged but got very minimal sentences of about 5 years. And that is what happened on this day in true crime-ish history. Stay tuned for the next. Hello and good evening, true crimeers. It is time for On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 24th. What happened on July 24th? Pictured here was 24-year-old Amy Wroe Bechtel. She was from Lander, Wyoming, and she lived there with her husband, Steve. Steve and Amy would marry in 1996. They moved to Lander, Wyoming because it was a very outdoorsy place and they were both very outdoorsy people. Both of them are very active people. Steve is a mountain climber while Amy is an avid runner. Amy was actually training to run a 10K, but unfortunately she would never get to do it. On July 24th, 1997, Steve would kiss his wife Amy goodbye around 9:30 in the morning because he was going with some friends to do some rock climbing. Amy also had a lot of plans that day. She had some errands to run and then she was going to finish the day by doing a practice run for the 10K. During that morning, there was confirmed sightings of Amy teaching a weightlifting class in the morning. She was then spotted at a camera shop. Amy then went to an art gallery, and that would be the last time anyone would actually see her. Her plan was to go to the Shoshone National Forest to do her run. Later on, there would be witnesses who would come forward to say they saw a woman who resembled Amy running on the roads in the forest. Steve got home later that afternoon into the early evening, and Amy still wasn't home. He thought, well, she is planning to do her run, so maybe she's going to be a little bit late. By about 10:30 that night, she's still not home, so he goes to the neighbor's house to see if they've seen her. They haven't. So Steve reports Amy missing. At approximately 1 o'clock in the morning the next day, Amy's vehicle is found parked near the forest where she was supposedly going to do her run. There were a couple personal belongings on the passenger seat. The only thing missing was her wallet. Over the course of the next 8 days, police and volunteers would search the area very thoroughly. There was no traces of Amy found anywhere. She just completely vanished. Police, of course, would begin to suspect her husband, Steve. This is him along the trail where she was last seen, just sort of searching the area. Police found journals in his house where he was writing about violence towards women, specifically his wife, but he claimed those were just song lyrics, which many people confirmed that's the case. Just a crazy coincidence. His lawyer would then say, do not take a polygraph test. So Steve stopped cooperating with police, which kind of made them a little suspicious, but he's never been named an official suspect in her disappearance or potential death. Amy's family has still pleaded with him to please speak to police, but still, he won't. Take that for what you will. Now, a witness did come forward around the time of the disappearance to say they saw a truck that looked very similar to this near where Amy was supposedly running. Steve Bechtel had a truck that looked pretty much identical, but still, he would not cooperate with police. Now, you should also look at that from the point of view that he does not want to go down the rabbit hole of being wrongfully pursued and then eventually convicted for something he may not have done. Police were able to confirm his alibi with his friends that he was in fact rock climbing for most of the day. It's also confirmed that at the exact same time the witness saw this vehicle near the park, it was confirmed that Steve was actually at home and made a phone call pretty much at the exact same time that the truck was spotted. So it could not have been Steve and his truck at the park the witness saw. There was also rumors of a convicted serial killer, this fella here. His name was Dale Wayne Eaton. He actually was in fact in the area where Amy Bechtel was last seen at the same time. He did kill several women, which he was convicted of, and then he was put on death row where he still waits to this day. But he also refuses to talk to police with regards to Amy's case. It should be noted that he has suffered a lot of brain issues, so even if he was responsible for Amy's disappearance and death, the doctors basically have said he would really have no way of really remembering. Amy has never been found. No trace of her has ever been found. They did find a watch similar to one Amy wore many years later, but it didn't really yield any actual evidence. It is just another case of another person vanishing into thin air. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is July 30th. What happened on July 30th? Well, a few things. On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa would kiss his family goodbye and never be seen again. He was the union president for the Teamsters, and he allegedly had a meeting with members of the mob. Did he make it to that meeting? Probably. Did he leave that meeting alive? Probably not. That being said, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa is considered one of the most infamous in our history. There has been wild speculation about where he may be buried. There has been conspiracy theories floated out there. Maybe aliens took him. Maybe he's still alive, like Elvis. There is a movie that I disliked immensely called The Irishman, where Al Pacino plays Jimmy Hoffa. It also stars Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci. I thought the movie was so boring, I'm sorry. Next up, a disaster, July 30th, 1971. A Japanese domestic flight carrying 162 souls would collide with a fighter jet. The fighter jet was being piloted by a trainee who was practicing basic maneuvering. The instructor said, break away, and before he could, it was too late. The pilot of the fighter jet, he was the only one in the jet at the time, he actually managed to survive with some severe injuries, but all 162 souls on board of the passenger aircraft, they would die. The pilot of the jet was charged with manslaughter, but he was actually acquitted. But the instructor was also charged with manslaughter. He was found guilty. He got 3 years suspended sentence, and he was fired from his job. And finally, on July 30th, 2008, one of the most brutal murders in Canadian history took place. I have told this story before, and most of you are pretty familiar with this. It was the murder of Tim McLean aboard a Greyhound bus. He was randomly targeted by Vince Lee here. Vince took out a knife as Tim was just sleeping and repeatedly stabbed him to death. He then dismembered Tim McLean, including removing his head. He then began to eat his body parts in front of the passengers who were screaming on the outside. Vince was arrested, but he was never put in prison. He spent a year in a mental institution where he was released and given a new identity.